George's eyes darted between Rex, the large Doberman pacing restlessly across the living room, and his wife Zoe, who was busy in the kitchen. The low growls rumbling from the dog's throat, and the way his gaze was fixed on Zoe, sent chills down George's spine. It was supposed to be simple, just a favor for Corey, his best friend, who needed someone to look after Rex while he was out of town for a few weeks. Corey had assured them that Rex was a retired police dog, well-trained and obedient. The first few days were smooth, almost boring. Rex was calm, polite, and barely made a sound. But now something was off. Rex's sudden change in behavior was impossible to ignore. He followed Zoe obsessively, his eyes never leaving her. At night, instead of sleeping peacefully on the floor, Rex would sit rigid by their bedroom door, ears perked, his eyes glinting in the darkness. His pacing had become relentless, back and forth, as if he was waiting for something to happen. The hair on his back bristled, and the growling had turned into occasional barking fits directed at Zoe, sending unease crawling down George's spine. What was wrong with him? It wasn't just the dog. Zoe had been acting strangely too. George tried to dismiss the thought, tried to convince himself that the stress of work and the presence of a new pet in their home were enough to explain it. But then there was the text message, a cryptic, unfinished sentence on Zoe's phone that George accidentally glimpsed one morning. The words were seared into his memory. "You've told me that I can't tell George about this, and that you'll tell him when the time is right. So that's what..." The message cut off, but the damage was done. A heavy sense of betrayal sank into George's chest, and from that moment on, trust was a fragile thing. He tried to dismiss it, to ignore the gnawing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. But Zoe's behavior made it impossible. She was distant, secretive, her smiles never reaching her eyes. She started leaving the house late at night, returning with flimsy excuses that did nothing to calm George's nerves. "I was just out for some air," she'd say, brushing past him. But George wasn't convinced, and Rex wasn't either. The dog's growls deepened whenever Zoe approached, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that was almost human. George knew police dogs were trained to detect things that humans couldn't: danger, deception, even certain chemicals. But what was Rex sensing? Then one night, George woke to find Zoe's side of the bed cold and empty. Panic gripped him as he hurried through the darkened house, calling her name. But before he could reach the front door, it swung open, and Zoe stepped inside, her face pale and eyes wide with shock. Behind her, Rex stood, hackles raised, blocking her path back into the house with a low, menacing growl. The sight froze George in his tracks. "What's going on?" he demanded. But Zoe only shook her head, her eyes glistening with something that looked dangerously close to guilt. Rex's behavior escalated after that night. He became more aggressive, more fixated on Zoe. George couldn't ignore it any longer. He needed answers. Reluctantly, he reached out to Corey, hoping his friend could shed some light on the situation. But Corey's response left him even more unsettled. Rex? Acting aggressive? Corey's confusion was palpable. That doesn't make sense. He's never acted like that before. Did something happen? George's mind raced, but he couldn't bring himself to tell Corey about the text message, or Zoe's late-night disappearances, or the way Rex growled at her like she was a threat. Over the next few days, George's unease grew into a sickening certainty that something was deeply wrong. Zoe continued to act distant, slipping out of the house for hours at a time, her phone always locked tight. Rex, meanwhile, was relentless in his surveillance, his eyes always tracking Zoe's movements, his growls turning to barks whenever she approached certain parts of the house, the closet, the basement door, the bathroom cabinet. George's nerves were frayed raw. He found himself checking the locks twice, peering out the windows at every sound, feeling like a stranger in his own home. And then there was the incident at the door. It was late, and George was already on edge when the knock came. He froze, exchanging a glance with Zoe, whose face drained of color. Rex's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The dog lunged at the door, barking furiously, his body a tense coil of muscle and rage. Zoe's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with something that looked a lot like fear. George's heart pounded painfully in his chest as he pulled her back, locking eyes with her for a split second. "Who is it? Zoe?" he demanded, his voice low and sharp. She said nothing, but the look in her eyes spoke volumes. The police arrived within minutes of George's panicked call, their flashlights slicing through the dark as they questioned Zoe and inspected the house. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern expression, knelt down to Rex's level, his eyes narrowing as he watched the dog's tense stance. "Retired police dog, huh?" The officer murmured, his voice thoughtful. "Trained to detect drugs, explosives, and—" His voice trailed off, but George's blood ran cold. And then came the revelation, one that shattered the uneasy silence and left George reeling. Zoe, her voice shaking, finally confessed. She had been hiding something, but it wasn't what George thought. She wasn't having an affair. The truth was far more shocking. Zoe was pregnant. The secret text, the late-night outings, the distance. Everything fell into place. She had been planning to tell George in her own time, terrified of complications given her family's history. Rex's obsessive behavior, his fixation on Zoe, was his way of protecting her, sensing the changes in her body. George's legs nearly gave out as the truth sank in. Relief, guilt, and a hollow sort of shock crashed over him all at once. He pulled Zoe into his arms, his apologies tumbling out in a broken rush. But even as he held her, his eyes flicked to Rex, who sat nearby, his watchful gaze never wavering. The dog's eyes glinted with a knowing sort of protectiveness, and George understood in that moment that Rex had never been the threat. He had been the warning. But one question remained unanswered, one that hung heavy in the air, refusing to be dismissed. If Rex had been protecting Zoe all along, then who, or what, was he protecting her from?